الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. حي على الفلاح.
Revolutionary sentiment was characteristic of the era in Iraq and throughout the Middle East. In Iraq, progressives and socialists assailed traditional political elites. Moreover, the pan-Arab nationalism of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt profoundly influenced young Arabs like Saddam Hussein. The rise of Nasser foreshadowed a wave of revolutions throughout the Middle East in the 1950s and 1960s. Nasser inspired nationalists throughout the Middle East by fighting the British and the French during the Suez Crisis of 1956, modernizing Egypt, and uniting the Arab world politically. Saddam was born in 1937, reared in a mud hut near Tikrit, north of Baghdad. From the age of 10, Saddam was reared by an uncle who encouraged him to dream of becoming a nationalist Arab hero like Saladin. The Ba'ath Party became a vehicle for Hussein. He became an enforcer for the party, and like Joseph Stalin, who fascinated Hussein, he left the intellectuals behind and climbed the ladder of Iraq politics, using a combination of intimidation, fear, nepotism, and outright murder. In 1958, a year after Saddam had joined the Ba'ath Party, army officers led by General Abd al-Karim Qasim overthrew Faisal II of Iraq. The Ba'athists opposed the new government, and in 1959, Saddam was involved in the unsuccessful United States-backed plot to assassinate Karim Qasim. Finally, in February 1963, the Iraqi Ba'ath took power after violently overthrowing Abd al-Karim Qasim and quashing communist-led resistance. Saddam Hussein now began his career as chief of Iraq's security services. He did his job with exceptional efficiency, executing opponents and suspected potential rivals, including scores of high-level government officials and thousands of political prisoners. By 1968, the radical arm of the Ba'ath Party was in total control of Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a consummate party politician whose formative experiences were in organizing clandestine opposition activity. He was adept at outmaneuvering and, at times, ruthlessly eliminating political opponents. By 1969, Saddam Hussein had become the moving force behind the party. He personally directed Ba'athist attempts to settle the Kurdish question, and he organized the party's institutional structure. Within a decade, he had created a police state within Iraq that was so oppressive that it has often received criticism from moderate Arab states. Between 1968 and 1973, through a series of sham trials, executions, assassinations, and intimidations, the party ruthlessly eliminated any group or person suspected of challenging Ba'ath rule. On July 16, 1979, Saddam Hussein officially became President of the Republic, Secretary General of the Ba'ath Party Regional Command, Chairman of the RCC, and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. He was now in complete control of Iraq, but for Saddam, Iraq was not enough. After 23 years in power, Saddam Hussein imagined himself a world player. The Iraqi dictator had used his country's enormous oil revenues and strategic location to entrench himself as a regional force. During a long and bloody war with Iran in the 1980s, Saddam had assembled the world's fourth largest army and equipped it with modern equipment. However, the long war with Iran proved costly. When it ended, Iraq was $80 billion in debt. To pay for that war, Saddam turned his eyes toward Kuwait.
Saddam Hussein was annoyed at the Kuwaitis for, in addition, not really providing a lot of assistance that he wanted in terms of the debt relief, but also for violating the production quotas in OPEC, which OPEC is a cartel, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They meet regularly to set production quotas with the idea that they will maintain price stability. So if any of the member states are violating the production quotas, potentially that's going to have an adverse effect on all the rest of them, because either they can choose to sell less oil or they can see the price go down. So if you're trying to generate revenue to pay back debt, you need to maximize the price of oil, which so Saddam was annoyed at Kuwait for that particular reason as well.
Saddam put out signals that he had designs on his neighbor, signals that went unanswered in the West.
Supposedly in July of 1990, when Saddam Hussein already had sort of Kuwait in the gun sights, if you will, he met with the United States ambassador, a woman named April Glaspie. Basically, Ambassador Glaspie said the United States takes no position on Arab conflicts. And then around that same time, the State Department released a statement that made it quite clear that the U.S. had no formal alliance obligations to Kuwait, which would suggest that if Kuwait were attacked, the United States would have no responsibility to come to its defense. Those were both certainly mixed signals that some people say may have had an effect influencing Saddam Hussein's decision to go against Kuwait.
Well, I don't think we gave any signals that the invasion of Kuwait would be acceptable, but we did basically support Iraq during the war with Iran. Iran was, I think from Washington's perspective, a pretty deadly enemy at that point after having taken the hostages and not having any relations. And we provided some support to Saddam Hussein in the 1980s.
If the United States had clearly signaled it would be wrong to attack Kuwait, and under the United Nations Charter it's illegal for any state to challenge the territorial integrity of another, and the United States is obliged under the United Nations Charter and as a member state of the Security Council to help to assure the defense of those states, who knows, that might have had the opposite effect of restraining Saddam Hussein. So I think it might be too strong to say it encouraged him, but it might be fair to think about the counterfactual of what would have happened had the U.S. said something completely different.
On August 2nd, 2 Iraqi divisions crossed the Kuwait border. A 3rd division launched a supporting attack further to the west. Meanwhile, Iraqi special forces mounted heliborne and amphibious raids on strategic targets in Kuwait City. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, it was all over. One of the main concerns of the West was the significant threat Iraq posed to Saudi Arabia. Following the conquest of Kuwait, the Iraqi army was within easy striking distance of Saudi oil fields. Possession of these fields, along with Kuwaiti and Iraqi reserves, would have given Hussein control over the majority of the world's oil reserves.
There was some fear that the next stop might be Saudi Arabia, which would be a much bigger player.
That would give Saddam Hussein control over about 40% of the world's reserves. And that was just too much to tolerate.
For President George H.W. Bush, there was only one possible response to what he called naked aggression. Acting on the policy of the Carter Doctrine, and out of fear the Iraqi army could launch an invasion of Saudi Arabia, U.S. President Bush quickly announced that the U.S. would launch a wholly defensive mission to prevent Iraq from invading Saudi Arabia under the name Operation Desert Shield.
Today, as president, I ask for your support in a decision I've made to stand up for what's right and condemn what's wrong, all in the cause of peace. At my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia.
Saddam invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, and the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, they took the next, 5-6 months to work with the Allies. It was considerably different than what George W. Bush did when he invaded Iraq in 2003. So it was, I think, a fairly skillful diplomacy on the U.S. part, and a different notion than what we saw later, too, a notion simply of building a multilateral coalition, getting the Saudis to fund a good part of it, getting some of the NATO allies to come in and provide troops, weapons, and so forth, but the U.S. bearing the bulk of it.
For the U.S. troops that were to be the bulk of this coalition, deployment to the Gulf came as a huge surprise.
We never heard of the country. What's Kuwait? What's so great about it that it's part of our national security? We started learning about the resources and started learning about Saddam Hussein's capability. And at first we thought it was just like another piece of news story. Somebody invaded somebody around the world, but as time went on, we started getting more and more news trickled down to us that this was becoming a more and more serious matter and more maybe involved than just what we see on TV.
I was young, I didn't really know what a lot of people knew, the older people, which I came to find out, like Iraq and Iran fighting for 7 years, and then you start thinking, you're like, these guys have been fighting for 7 years, they're battle hardened, and I'd say there's some anxiety, but I mean, it wasn't really noticeable. We didn't have a problem with soldiers going AWOL or anything like that. People just started buckling down and doing what they had to do.
This wholly defensive doctrine was quickly abandoned when on August 8th, Iraq declared Kuwait to be the 19th province of Iraq. On August 9th, after a 14-hour flight, a group of 25 F-15s touched down at Saudi airfields. As the F-15s began their air patrols, the first units of the 82nd Airborne Division arrived in Bahrain and began setting up defensive positions. Along with the airborne troops, the legendary 1st Marine Division formed the nucleus of the massive seaborne force sent in response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait.
Well, the primary goal at the time we were moving into the country and getting established, the primary objective was what they called the defense of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Our job was, we saw that Saddam had put the Iraqi forces up along the Kuwaiti-Saudi border. It looked like they were going to come at us, so what kind of plan could we come up with to thwart any kind of attack that would come into the theater? And so for the first month at least, everybody was pouring their efforts into a defensive plan. How do we get the logistics to soldiers that are fighting and retreating back, fighting and retreating back? And how do we keep those logistical lines intact with all that moving back? And we seem to move through that successfully.
As at Guadalcanal and the rush to Korea, the U.S. Marines were ordered to scrape together the tools of war to face a formidable foe.
The Army gets all the new stuff. They get all the new tanks. They get all the new trucks. They get all the new stuff. The Marines get, leftover stuff, and they just teach you from, again, boot camp. You're a Marine. You do what you got to do. Do whatever it takes to get the mission done. That's how they got the nickname Devil Dogs. They do whatever it takes to accomplish your mission.
Facing overwhelming odds, The troops referred to themselves as Iraqi speed bumps. During the early days of Desert Shield, a powerful 18,000-man amphibious task force steamed into the North Arabian Sea to add an important element to the Allied arsenal. The task force, with Marines from the 4th Marine Expeditionary Brigade and the 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit, included air, land, and sea assets tailor-made for coastal assault. These included Harrier attack jets and assault helicopters to provide air cover for infantry and armor that would hit the beach aboard high-speed air cushion landing craft, LCACs. As the Marines took up defensive positions on land and at sea, General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, commander of U.S. Central Command, began to amass a force capable of removing the Iraqi presence from Kuwait. Thousands of ground troops poured into the Saudi desert. By the end of August, an airlift was in full swing, with a plane touching down every 22 minutes. Pilots began to talk about an aluminum bridge between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. At the same time, ships were beginning to arrive at ports up and down the Saudi coast, carrying the infantry fighting vehicles and the main battle tanks of the armored formations that would lead the charge into the desert. The principal combat vehicles in these formations included the M1A1 Abrams tank and the Bradley fighting vehicle, in both its infantry and cavalry configurations.
The Bradley, what it brought to the table was an offensive capability. It carried the 25 millimeter chain gun and a tow that could be used in an offensive manner as well as in the defense. So, and it could move as fast as the Abrams. So the huge improvement over the 113 and even the Abrams, the improvement of the Abrams over the previous M60 was this rate of march. They were designed and developed for offensive style of warfare.
The newly fielded M1A1 Abrams tank included several improvements over the original M1. It carried a more powerful 120mm gun, possessed better armor protection, and had better protection against nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Marine Corps tank units entered combat with M60A3. These vehicles provided the heavy metal necessary to stop the armored might of Saddam's army, which included large numbers of Russian-built T-72s and BMPs.
You know, T-72 was the best tank that they had. Most of their forces were equipped with T-55s or some T-62s. So their equipment was at best early Cold War equipment. So I knew their range of their weapon systems was far less than the Abrams. So I knew that in a firefight that I had the range overmatch. Also, their T-72, the best tank they had, utilized an autoloader. And from the basic course and the scout platooners course, we knew that the autoloader took several seconds longer to reload than the manned Abrams. So 2.5 seconds to reload a round on an Abrams would be considered slow. And I knew that I could probably get 3 rounds off before T-72 could re-engage.
Schwarzkopf now believed he had the upper hand. By early October, he told Powell the window of vulnerability had closed. The speed bump had become a wall.
Our strategy to go after this army is very, very simple. First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it.
In the early stages of planning, General Schwarzkopf had been offered the assistance of 5 recent graduates of the School for Advanced Military Studies, the finest war college in the world. Schwarzkopf dubbed them the Jedi Knights and assigned them the task of planning the ground assault against Iraq. The Iraqi position presented some very promising possibilities. Saddam's infantry divisions had dug in along a 175-mile line from the Persian Gulf along the Kuwait-Saudi border, 40 miles into Iraq. Hussein had also deployed additional troops along the Kuwait coast, protecting against an amphibious assault by the much-feared Marines, already rehearsing for a landing. Supporting the frontline units were armored infantry and mechanized infantry reserves. The Republican Guard, which had led the push into Kuwait, had been pulled back into southern Iraq, ready to plug any breach in the line. The Jedi Knights knew that by orienting his entire force to the southeast, Saddam had left his right flank open to attack. A swift drive to the north, followed by a sharp eastward turn, would cut Iraq's army off so that the coalition could kill it. Schwarzkopf called the proposed flanking maneuver the Hail Mary. But the plan was nearly compromised before the troops on the ground could be put into motion.
And we had actually tipped our hands, especially on one particular occasion. We had mounted 2,000 aircraft. The flash briefing came down that they were going to mount 2,000 aircraft, basically everything they can get up in the air at one time, and fly it so much toward Iraq in such a high speed it looked like we were actually going to start a bombing run into Iraq itself.
The Great Air Armada never entered Iraqi airspace.
And then they would stop just short of the Saudi, Iraqi, and Kuwaiti border, all along that Saudi border there, and they would stop and then divert away back south. But if Saddam had really looked at that situation for what it was, he would have recognized if we were able to put that many aircraft in the air, we were ready then.
Even at that early date, the coalition air power was enormous.
And it was incredible. I'd never seen such a display of flying power in all my life. I mean, you would look up and you would just see everything. The black specks of the B-52, they're so high up, and you see the lower flying aircraft, the F-14s, the F-18s, and as you're looking up, suddenly you're just out of relapse or out of reaction. You're ducking because A-10s just flew over your head because they keep up with the sand dunes.
In order for the Hail Mary to work, Central Command needed to maintain the illusion of an amphibious landing and prevent the realignment of Iraqi forces to the west. Therefore, Marines off the Kuwaiti coast went through regular exercises to make it appear that they were preparing for an amphibious attack.
At that same time, the Marine Expeditionary Force were mounting false amphibious assaults. They would try to charge toward the one island. There was an island just off of Kuwait City in the Persian Gulf that Saddam had also secured. The MEF would mount up and do practice runs on that island, and they would just stop short of the island, turn around, and come back to their base.
A diversionary landing was not the only distraction that caught the attention of the Iraqi army.
And so there was a lot of fear tactics that we were using at that point. Using a lot of putting up, taking damaged fuel lines, damaged helicopters, damaged fueling trucks, things that we cannot use, setting them out in the middle of nowhere and just piling it up, making it look like it's operational to Iraqi intelligence, and they would in turn divert whole divisions of troops over because we had them thinking we were going to do something there. And what it did, it ended up effectively in many ways dividing up the Iraqi army before we even started fighting them.
The media, believing a bloody frontal assault inevitable, dutifully covered the preparations. Training grew more intense as the amphibious forces performed high-visibility exercises off the coast of Saudi Arabia to heighten the enemy wariness of an invasion from the sea.
It was very incredible, the deceptive operations that were going on. A lot of people don't give a lot of credit to psychological operations, how powerful they really are. And we had used an awful lot of that to convince the Iraqi army that we weren't ready to go by January at the time of the UN deadline, which was January 15th. And we were ready to go, honestly, probably as far back as November. But we wanted them to think we weren't ready, and so they kept packing their stuff away because where Saddam had isolated himself, he thought the Arab region would stand behind him.
Along with massive amphibious exercises, embarked Marines responded to calls for assistance from Maritime Interception Force warships. Marines were among the first combat troops placed aboard uncooperative Iraqi tankers during maritime intercepts in the early days of Desert Shield. As G-Day, the beginning of the ground war, neared, 17,000 Marines stood ready aboard the largest combined amphibious assault force since the Incheon landing in Korea. Meanwhile, the coalition's ground forces conducted feints and reconnaissance in force along the Kuwaiti border. A day before the launch of Operation Sabre, the sailors and Marines of the amphibious force found that their warfighting skills would not be immediately required as they had expected. But their preparation had not been in vain. It was at the core of the deceptive tactics which played a major role in the quick Allied victory. As the beginning of the ground war drew near, intelligence indicated that there had been no shifting of Iraqi forces. The grand deception had worked.
General Schwarzkopf had given a briefing that if the President of the United States would ask them to go at the time of the deadline, that they would be short of actually defying the order, saying they wouldn't be ready until February. We're in fact ready to go before Christmas.
The trap was set.